Good evening. Welcome again to another session of Public Affairs, Public Access. I'm your guest host, David Hutzelman, and this is a show where we usually talk about items of political philosophy, political policy, politics in general, from a libertarian perspective. And I'm often asked, well, what is a libertarian's perspective anyway? And so I always take 30 seconds to try to delineate what that really means. Libertarians are people that believe in a political philosophy, and I guess I ought to stress that it's not really a moral philosophy. It really doesn't tell you how to live a good life or how to be a good person. It's just a political philosophy. And basically it's based on three separate issues. One, that libertarians favor a free market economy, not the overregulated crony capitalism that we have that parades as a free market economy today. We're very supportive of individual and civil liberties, and we believe that you have the right to live your own life the way you want to live it without the undue influences of any government regulation and policies which interfere with how you think you ought to be able to enjoy your life. And from a foreign policy standpoint, we're generally very non-interventionist in terms of not thinking that we have the solution to every problem around the world, especially not the solution that involves military force to kind of impose our values and virtues upon other countries which may not have the same kind of historical background that we have. So tonight, we're going to be delving into the foreign policy issues, which we haven't done before, at least on my show. And we're going to be exploring that from the standpoint of a group that has its origins here in Houston. It's called the Foreign Policy Alliance. And it's a group of people that are dedicated to creating a rational, non-interventionist foreign policy for the United States, and trying to spread that to other places around the country and to the Congress as well, to enable us to recast American foreign policy in a way that is more pro-freedom, pro-liberty, pro-respectful of other nations around the world. So tonight I'm very honored to have with me a gentleman who is on the cusp of that effort here in Houston. His name is Alan Vogel, and he is here representing the Foreign Policy Institute. Alan is a longtime friend of mine. We have gone back considerable years in the Libertarian Party with various electoral initiatives on both his and my part. And he and I have moved on to his other more issue-related things other than just strictly party-related things. So the Libertarian Party generally endorses a non-interventionist foreign policy, and I think this is a very good way for a left and right synthesis in the political spectrum to come across a policy that we can all, or most of us, agree on, in terms of one that promotes human liberty across the globe and is one that we can use the United States to be an example of, hopefully, in the future as a means of promoting that ideal. So with no further introductions, I'll let Alan give us a brief synopsis of what his involvement with the Foreign Policy Alliance has been, why he joined the Foreign Policy Alliance, and what he hopes to accomplish in that organization.
Thank you for having me tonight, David. Yes, let me go back a few years. I think foreign policy has been one of the issues I've been most interested in because I went to school, I went to college during the Vietnam War, And so that was a constant presence in my mind and around the country as that war evolved and deteriorated. At that time, there was no Libertarian Party. I'd never heard the word Libertarian used except in the phrase civil Libertarian. After I graduated from college, I then discovered the Libertarian Party, and I was very interested in it because the Libertarian Party was talking about a non-interventionist foreign policy. And gradually I got more involved in the Libertarian Party. I wound up running for political office on any number of occasions, was involved in petition drives, was involved in local issues, and over several decades, I managed to accomplish very little in terms of political achievements. When I became aware of the Foreign Policy Alliance, I got interested because it wasn't just a libertarian group, it was a group that was drawing people in from all across the political spectrum. And that's what I thought would give this an opportunity for making a change in U.S. foreign policy. And that's basically the objective of the group, is to reform United States foreign policy. And I brought some slides with me tonight which we can go through and maybe we can spend a little time on them, and I can read over the resolution that we've adopted, and maybe we can discuss how that fits into reforming foreign policy.
What do you hope to, I also need to mention to my viewers, to the viewers here, that there is a call-in number, going to be a call-in number anyway, on the screen where you can call in and ask questions of Alan, or myself for that matter. But that I realize that your main initiative is a set of resolutions, which you have, to change American foreign policy. And what, in terms of taking a resolution and moving it forward, what's the strategy in terms of people to, getting people to sign on, I suppose, some way or other to that
Correct.
resolution and create a political upswell or whatever to cause it to be looked at seriously by members of Congress?
Yes, ultimately it's the Congress that gets to make the decision about what our foreign policy should be, at least according to the founding documents of this country, although it's been the President, unfortunately, who has taken over that power since at least...
Not just the current President.
Not the current President only. This has been going on for over 100 years, and you know, from the time of Teddy Roosevelt and the Spanish-American War to Woodrow Wilson and the war to end all wars, to Harry Truman with the Truman Doctrine, which really set the tone for the modern American foreign policy, which was a confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. But the Cold War is over, and we haven't changed our foreign policy. We're still using that same approach to foreign policy. We need to change it to come up with a more effective foreign policy that will make us safer and more secure, and will cost us a whole lot less in terms of lives lost and money spent. Now, we have to change the Congress, the mind of the Congress, but the Congress always follows the people. That happened, the Vietnam War is really a touchstone for me on many of these cases, because we haven't learned the lesson of Vietnam. What happened during that war is that the people eventually got sick of it. And it was the people who, through protest, through the famous Life magazine issue where they portrayed the pictures of that week's worth of dead Americans, over a period of time, the Congress eventually got the message that the people weren't supporting the war anymore. They started cutting the spending, and eventually we got out of Vietnam. But we haven't learned that lesson. We need to apply that lesson to all across the board. And the Congress is not going to pay attention until the people pay attention. So this is a long-term project. And the concept behind it is to come up with an approach that will not just apply to Democrats or Republicans. Now, I'm a Libertarian, but this group, the Foreign Policy Alliance, it has its origins from a couple of years ago where there was a conference here in Houston on this subject. And the participants in that conference were Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, people from the conservative and the liberal spectrum. And afterwards, a number of those people decided, what can we do in the long term? And they decided that let's put together a resolution. Let's get a resolution that we can all agree on, that we have a consensus across the political spectrum, that we can then bring that resolution to the people, and as we begin to get people to endorse that resolution, then we'll eventually get the Congress to respond to it. The Congress will follow us eventually. So that's what we've been doing. Now, it took us a good 9 months to sit down and work out and argue and discuss what we could agree on to put in this resolution. And we have a resolution that comprises 14 points. Yeah. And basically it's a consensus resolution, and it's really an outline for the Congress to use to develop a new foreign policy. It doesn't say we shall do this in this case. It says these are the principles we need to recommend and we need to live by. So that's our approach. We're now in the process of getting people to sign our resolution. We're looking for individuals to sign it, and you can sign it electronically by going to our website, foreignpolicyalliance.org. You can sign it electronically there. You can also write your congressman and your 2 senators there and tell them that you signed that resolution and that you want them to read it and pay attention to it. We've also been able to get a number of academic writers and some military people to endorse the resolution. And so that's the procedure that we're going through, and it's going to be a long-term process, but it's one that we're started on, and we're beginning to get a little bit of support, and we think it's going to grow.
Great. Wow, that sounds like a very interesting initiative. I think what you said was this is a foreign policy to replace the foreign policy that was basically evolved during the so-called Cold War, which was basically a substitute for a hot war, which would satisfy, in my mind anyway, the military-industrial complex's desire to keep defense spending up, even though there was no hot war being fought, but that nonetheless we needed to have the war mentality to appeal to the American people so we just called it a Cold War, and we could basically have all the benefits of a hot war without actually killing people, but all the spending and taxpayer-funded initiatives associated with the war.
That's partially correct, David.
Okay.
Actually, during that Cold War, we had plenty of hot wars going on. It's been over 70 years now since the end of World War II. And during that time, the United States has been involved in at least 28 wars or military actions. Let me show you an interesting chart here. Now, I don't have this on a slide, but just to tell you how you can refer to this. This is from Wikipedia. This is the United States military casualties of war, and it's a chart, and it shows from the beginning of the country, the American Revolutionary War, all the way down to today. It shows all of these wars that we've been involved in and the number of casualties we've taken in terms of lives lost and people wounded. We go right about to here, and this is about where World War II is. Look at all that's happened since World War II. 28 different, at least 28, there's some of them we probably haven't been told about, at least 28 different actions. And what's happened here since World War II, we have lost over 100,000 American dead, over 300,000 American wounded, and spent trillions of dollars. So
in a period that we normally associate with relative peacetime.
Allegedly, it was peacetime. But of course, the big wars during that period were the Vietnam War, where we lost about 58,000 people, the Korean War, where we lost about 36,000 people, and the current series of wars and skirmishes that are going on, where the death toll is approaching 7,000. But all told, we've spent a huge amount of money. We've had enormous loss of life, people wounded in a terrible fashion that we're going to be paying for the rest of their lives. And what have we really accomplished?
Not to count civilian casualties, which are multiples and multiples more than those.
That's true. And of course, we're not even considering the people on the other sides,
Yeah.
who have suffered much more. And you know, I think a lot of Americans are beginning to ask themselves, you know, what else could those men have done with their lives? What else could all that money have been spent for? It's time, I think, for us to seriously debate changing our foreign policy and looking for a foreign policy that is going to make us safer and make us for a more stable world, because this foreign policy clearly hasn't worked. If anything, it's made things worse. We're spending an enormous amount of money. We don't live in a safe world. At least most of the people in the world don't live in a safe world. One of the things that Americans are told all the time in order to encourage us to get into these wars is how dangerous this world is. And yet, if you look at a globe, you can see the United States is right there, and there's a big ocean to one side of us and a big ocean to the other side of us, and the countries to our north and our south are generally friendly and have weak militaries. The United States is not at real threat from anyone.
Right. Okay. Well, maybe you could take us into some of the wording of the resolution itself, and
Okay.
see what
Great.
conversations might develop as a result of that. I think the resolution is going to be stated in the terms of, whereas we have these situations which don't seem to be tolerable or desirable, and then we need to reformulate our foreign policy based on these principles.
Right.
So why don't you take us through the whereases, and
Okay,
we'll
let's-
maybe try to explore some of them in a little detail.
Okay, let's run through the slides, and then I will read them, and then we can discuss them as necessary. One of the things that was learned from this conference that we had is that there is a considerable amount of agreement across the political spectrum on some issues. That is, we need to curtail our foreign interventions. We need to cut military spending. We need to uphold civil liberties. And we need to end unconstitutional wars. So with those 4 points of agreements, we put together the basic mission and the resolution that we have. If we could go to the next slide. This is our mission. The Foreign Policy Alliance is a multi-partisan organization that works to build support across the political spectrum for a U.S. foreign policy that emphasizes diplomacy, law, and cooperation rather than costly and counterproductive military intervention that needlessly puts U.S. military personnel and innocent civilians in harm's way. Let's go on to the next slide.
Well, let me just ask you about
yes.
that just for a second. What does needlessly mean in that? So, I mean, I gather that this initiative does not say that U.S. military personnel is never needed in terms of
No.
protecting
No,
U.S. interests.
It does not say that. And remember, because this is a resolution that looks across the political spectrum, I, as a libertarian, might have somewhat of a different view about what needlessly means compared to somebody on the other side of the political spectrum.
Right.
So it doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. But that's something that we ought to be arguing about in the Congress. That's what Congress is there for, is to debate these issues and to talk about them and to figure out whether some action that is being suggested is really something that we should get into. And if you go back to our origins, the foreign policy that Thomas Jefferson recommended in his first inaugural address was one of peace, commerce, and friendship among all nations, entangling alliances with none. So from my libertarian view, I take that very narrowly, that if we're attacked, yes, we defend ourselves. Now, some people might say that there are other occasions in which we need to involve the military. However, this is something that should always be debated in Congress. Since one of the interesting things about this last 70 years of Cold War, hot wars, since the Truman Doctrine, is not a single one of these wars or military actions has been authorized by Congress in the way that the Congress was intended to do through the Constitution. The last war that we've been involved in that was declared by Congress was the Second World War.
Interesting. Okay. Well, very good. Let's proceed with the whereas.
Okay. let's go on to the next slide. Are we ready for the next slide? Well, let me just read them. Here we go. There we go. First, whereas America's military personnel are being killed and wounded and civilian casualties inflicted in wars fought for purposes unrelated to America's vital security, which the U.S. government defines too broadly.
Okay. Now, vital security interests obviously bring a question mark as to exactly what are our vital security interests. Now, one of the things we might comment on is that certainly in the issue of all of our involvement in the Middle East is that oil, the access to oil, is a vital security interest for the United States.
Well, some people might say that, and I guess that's usually a justification. Of course, from my perspective, it's not a vital security interest. If all of that oil, all of that energy were totally cut off, we, the United States, is capable with our friendly allies to produce the energy that we need. And in fact, that's more true today than it has been in past years.
Yes, I would say so.
Exactly, because of technological developments.
Right. The fracking has really made the U.S. a net exporter of crude oil and natural gas.
But if you should believe that it's in our vital security interest to go and attack people on the other side of the world, then that should be debated in Congress point blank without coming up with external reasons why this country over there is a threat to us militarily. Let's be honest about it. If you want to take their oil, then we should debate it. And I say that we can take care of ourselves. We don't need to take their oil. We can agree to buy their oil. We can follow Thomas Jefferson's advice, peace, commerce, and friendship among all nations.
Okay, very good. All right, moving on to the next whereas.
Okay, whereas number 2. The next slide. America's military interventions in other countries have led to costly blowback and unintended consequences.
We have a couple of cartoons or photographs here which depict what?
One of these cartoons shows a couple of American bombers dropping bombs. And down below it says Syria, Assad, rebels, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. And one of the pilots is talking to the other, whose side are we on? And the other guy says, I don't know. This is a big problem in Syria where there are so many sides fighting. And in fact, we apparently are supplying both sides in some cases. We don't know for sure who we're supporting over there. Why should we be over there to start with?
And of course, the idea that our interventions have led to costly blowbacks goes way back to 9/11 and Osama bin Laden, who had at one time had postulated an ultimatum to the United States about his demands for the United States foreign policy, which were basically he was so enraged that the U.S. had troops based in Saudi Arabia, which was his home country at that time, that he was so upset that, we could certainly imagine if some foreign government had foreign troops based in our country, we might not be exactly excited about that as well. But that our attempt to continue that foreign policy and not pay any attention to what some other legitimate Arab or Saudi, whatever concerns might have been, had ultimately led to the catastrophes of 9/11, which were, I'm not trying to say they're justified, but nonetheless, it certainly seems that they were partially a motivation for that kind of retaliation.
The United States and other Western powers have been involved in the Middle East for over 100 years now. It was at the time of the First World War when we redrew the boundaries for the countries in the Middle East in the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Yeah, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, basically.
Exactly. Instead of letting people fulfill their own needs, we had people draw lines on the paper and arbitrarily place them into categories. And our intervention has gone on and gotten worse. In 1953, Iran had elected a prime minister and had a fully functioning democratic government, but it was not suitable to some of our interests and some of our oil interests, most likely. And I'm talking about not just the United States, but the Western powers in general. And so we, Britain, the United States, engineered a coup which brought in the Shah in 1953. And that was a terrible time for the Iranian people and has resonated today. We're still enemies of the Iranian government, whereas the Iranian people and the American people have no reason to hate each other. We can be friends if our governments would stop messing with each other and allow and simply but that's an example of that blowback, right, where if you interfere, there are consequences to actions which don't always end as beautifully as the perpetrators in Washington might think they were. You know, even if you can go onto a battleship with a big mission accomplished sign, that doesn't mean that you've reached an end to the turmoil.
Exactly. Okay, and 3, whereas?
Okay, whereas outdated Cold War alliances create tripwires that could compel the use of U.S. military force to resolve conflicts.
Where's an example of that?
Well, there's an example of that just about everywhere. In particular, we could talk about Korea, but one of the things is that most people are not aware of this. There are over 700 military bases and installations that the United States has around the world. There are only a couple of hundred countries in the world, and we have these bases or installations in 130 countries. So we have multiple bases and installations in many countries. This is creates a situation where we have tripwires all over the world that could cause an incident. And the one in Korea is particularly relevant now because we just installed a new missile defense system in South Korea, which China is not very happy about at all because, well, it's comparable to, if you remember the Cuban missile crisis, the Americans were very upset that the Russians were putting missiles into Cuba, and we came close to a world war, or perhaps the end of the world. What do you think the Chinese think about us having, the United States having, this new missile defense installation, which is in close range of Peking?
Yeah, close. A missile defense installation is a little bit different than a missile attack installation.
Well, yes, but what if you were on the other side? Do you think that that Castro was interested in attacking the United States with the missiles that he was bringing in from the Soviets? I suspect that he thought of it as a defense for himself. And the South Koreans may think of it that way, but the North Koreans and the Chinese may think of it quite differently.
Maybe. Okay. Number 4.
Number 4. Whereas escalating tensions between the U.S. and other nuclear powers are moving our nations toward military confrontation and potential nuclear war. I suppose that speaks for itself.
I'm just wondering, are you, I realize that Russia is in the news a lot these days. Are you equating, would you equate our current dealings with Russia as a reenactment of the Cold War that we were facing with Russia, or do you think it's significantly different today?
I think it's potentially significantly different. It's interesting to me how many of the liberal commentators right now are talking about this issue and saying, well, Russia is our enemy.
Yes, I'm really surprised at that. Looking for enemies on both sides of the political spectrum.
Well, we don't need any enemies. Let's make friends.
I know, exactly. Okay, moving on to 5.
Whereas erosion of civil liberties long held dear by Americans, including freedom from warrantless surveillance, searches and seizures, has accelerated with the passage of the USA Patriot Act, the National Defense Authorization Act, and the USA Freedom Act. You know, this has been one of the great casualties of the world since 9/11, is that in a sense you could say that the terrorists won that issue because they have put us in the position where many of us have been willing to give up our civil liberties and let the government surveil us, put us under threat of imprisonment, things that would never have been considered in an earlier era. This is a very dangerous path we're going on, and even the other day, Mr. Trump is supposed to have been talking about jailing journalists. This whole area of civil liberties is a scary, bad path that we're moving on.
Okay. Moving on to number 6.
Whereas in a post-Cold War era, the U.S. can safely reduce its security budget by developing a new and more relevant strategy for right-sizing the military to better deal with 21st century security needs.
Why don't you explain those 2 illustrations there at the bottom of the screen, Alan?
All right, let's see if I can see them here. Well, these are a couple of cartoons. In the one case, we have a drone plane that looks like he's busily eating up the Treasury. In the other case, we have a gigantic military man with all sorts of incredible weapons, whereas the threat of cybersecurity is manned by one little geek over there sitting behind his laptop. There are many people today who say that we're in much more danger from a cyber war than we are from a ground war or any other kind of war that could be brought against us. If we're going to be right-sizing our security, we need to stop putting all of that money into the hardware items and start looking at how we can protect our cyber selves and how we can act in a more peaceful and stable manner.
Okay. Number 7.
Whereas a healthy U.S. economy is critical to an effective security program, but is now put at risk by the $1 trillion annual national security budget that contributes to an $18 trillion plus national debt. And let me tell you, this slide is now out of date. The last I saw, we're in the $20 trillion national debt range. This is ultimately what happened to the Roman Empire and to the Soviet Union. They spent themselves into oblivion. We're likely to do the same thing. I mean, consider a $20 trillion debt. If you were paying 5% interest on that, that'd be $1 trillion a year. Interest rates aren't that high now, and probably won't be allowed to get that high because we would go bankrupt too quickly. But still, at the current interest rates, we're still paying several $100 billion a year on our national debt. This is, in the long range, unsustainable, and it will ultimately take us down if we keep going down this road.
Okay. I've seen many stories, many analysis saying that the most important factor, if you ever did get into a war, was your economy. If you had an economy that was, you could redirect or retool to promote those things that would aid your defense, you were much more likely to defeat an adversary with a smaller economy or less robust economy who wasn't able to have the same flexibility that you had.
Well, wars are very expensive, and somebody has to pay for them. They're either paid for by taxes, our inflation, our looting, our plundering. Historically, all of those things, or some combination of them. And wars are getting more and more expensive because we've learned in the last half century, the one little thing that we've learned is that Americans don't really like to see too many dead Americans coming home. So we spend a lot more on technology that's very expensive to prevent that from happening.
Okay, well now we're moving on to the solution that therefore that whereas all these things we have talked about, now be it resolved that
the government of the United States should immediately begin a transition to a foreign policy that includes, the next slide.
A number of items here.
Yes, we have rejecting the role of policemen of the world, ceasing military and covert intervention in the affairs of foreign countries, and using military force only when absolutely necessary to protect U.S. sovereignty, territory, and vital interests narrowly defined.
Which would rule out, quote, the presumed popularity of so-called humanitarian wars.
Yes, it would. This is an issue. We have the case that's happened most recently where we had a alleged humanitarian strike on Syria as a result of chemical weapons being used by some group, perhaps the Syrian government or perhaps some other group, and we spent $100 million attacking a base, and there's simply no constitutional basis for doing that. We need to, in my view, we need to very narrowly define what we're doing.
Yeah.
Our military is...
And the magnitude of it, take for instance the Rwandan genocide of what, 1990s was that? I'm not sure.
Yes.
It was, but I mean, there were presumably 2 million people killed in Central Africa, and we didn't have any political will or influences to try to intervene in that unfortunate slaughter of human beings. But nonetheless, in smaller cases where it seems to be more politically sensitive, we seem to be able to make a reason to get involved with all sorts of things.
Well, you know, there are some cynics who would suggest that there has to be oil involved for us to get involved.
Oh, is that it? Okay. Which, with fracking technology today, makes no sense whatsoever.
All right.
Okay. Go ahead. 2.
Okay.
Next thing, do.
Resolve number 2, substantially reducing the more than 700 U.S. military installations around the world. One of our endorsers has written a book on this subject. His name is David Vine. His book is entitled Base Nation, How U.S. Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. And he goes into that in considerable detail. But in the first place, maintaining 700 military bases is, I don't know if anybody's compiled what it costs, but clearly it's an enormous expense. And it means that we also have all of those people all over the world. We have all of those tripwires. Do we really need 700 military bases around the world? If that's the maximum we need, then perhaps we need to at least start discussing cutting down on those, limiting the amount of military bases we have around the world. At the very least, we need to discuss that seriously in Congress.
Yeah, it's hard to believe exactly what the threat that's being posed. Of course, I guess people can argue that the world is a small place these days and the threat could come from anywhere. But I think at the time when that philosophy was probably at its peak, it was because of maybe the success that the communist ideology was having in terms of creating independent nations whose rulers became publicly supportive of communist ideology, and we felt that that was going to be a problem from our international perspective.
You know, you could get me started on a whole political philosophy area right here,
Okay.
David, because one of the things that I do not understand is if you go back 70 years after World War II, and when the American government, the leaders in Congress, why did they feel so threatened by this communist ideology, which they clearly knew, or they should have known, was inferior to our approach to economics and society?
If you remember reading the Defense Department projections of Russian and Soviet Union, both economic and military power, they were frightening. And when the Iron Curtain came down, it was revealed that the Russian economy was about the size of Spain.
Exactly.
And, it was just all hype, but all done to keep the military spending spigot open, and those people involved with that continuing to be recipients of the taxpayer money.
Well, to bring you up to date on one specific thing about that, look at what we're being told today. Well, let's go back a few years first. Look what we were told about the threat from Iraq. Remember, we were told that Saddam Hussein had the third largest army in the world, that he was like Hitler. This was a grave threat to the world. Well, it all turned out to be manufactured. It simply wasn't true. And as we can see, he was a pushover, ultimately. Well, look what we're being told about North Korea today. We're being told that North Korea is this tremendous threat to the world. Yet North Korea, it's a country that's about the size of the state of Mississippi, and its economy is smaller than any single state in the United States. And the South Koreans, they have twice the number of people that the North Koreans have, and their economy is more than 60 times larger than the North Korean economy. How is it possible that North Korea can be this grave threat to the world that we're being told that it is?
Well, I guess just like any individual terrorist can be a grave threat to the United States. I mean, whatever, 8 Saudi Arabian dissident terrorists have brought down the World Towers. So, I mean, I guess people can be conjured into thinking that that's the kind of threat that could be proposed.
But you use the word conjure, and that's what it is.
Yeah, right. I understand.
It's a manipulation of our thought process, and it simply isn't true if you look at reality. Shall we go on to the resolve number 3, curtailing the bloated military budget, allowing resources to be redirected towards cutting the deficit, cutting taxes, investing in America, or any other use as Americans see fit.
You want to comment on that middle illustration there? I can't remember what the current analysis of the U.S. military budget compared to others. At one time it was larger than the next 10 nations combined. I'm not sure if that's still a valid...
the last figure I've seen is that it's larger than the next 7 countries combined.
Next 7, okay.
Yeah. We spend about a quarter of our entire budget on the military. And, we're far outpace any other country in the world. Of course, there are some who would suggest that military-industrial complex is part of the problem. I think President Eisenhower warned us about that when he left office about 1960. But we didn't pay much attention to him, and it keeps growing.
Yep, I agree.
Okay, the resolve number 4, reducing the size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal to a minimum deterrent level and fully supporting the implementation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Should we go on to 5?
Well, just a quick, today it says here we have 23,000 nuclear weapons around the world. I guess that's down from more than 100,000 back in the peak of the so-called Cold War. So we are making some progress, although I don't know if 23,000 are enough to blow up the whole planet or not.
Well, under the terms of the treaty, by February 2018, each side is supposed to reduce its strategic nuclear forces to 1,550 warheads with no more than 700 deployed strategic missiles and bombers. There's not really been any greater progress on that, but it's something that we need to be discussing. Although this is the greatest threat we face, in a sense, it's also the least likely threat we face, in a sense, because anyone who starts a nuclear war with another nuclear power knows that it's going to be devastating to them, which is ultimately what may have caused the Cuban Missile Crisis to have ended. Certainly this is the case with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. He is said to have nuclear weapons. Some people say that he doesn't, but we'll assume that he does. His last explosion was about 3/4 of the size of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. He doesn't have the means for delivering it. If he actually tried to deliver it somewhere, he certainly knows that he would be wiped out. North Korea, of course, North Korea was devastated in the Korean War. They say that there was no building in North Korea still standing more than 2 stories tall.
Wow.
And any small nuclear player, governmental nuclear player, knows that it's not a good idea to start a nuclear war.
Yeah, although you get some people that I might characterize as potentially unstable, like Pakistan and other places in the Islamic world that.
Well, there are those that suggest that that is the greatest nuclear threat is the India-Pakistan situation.
Yeah. Okay.
And that may well be the case. If we would dial back on our military intervention and begin to promote diplomacy and law and cooperation, maybe we could chat with the Indians and the Pakistanis and help them resolve some of their issues on a diplomatic basis. The Indians and the Pakistanis could get into that kind of a conflict. Hopefully it would not involve other countries besides that.
Okay. Number 5.
Well, number 5, right to what I was just talking about, emphasizing diplomacy, law and cooperation in international relations and dispute resolution. Number 6, upholding civil liberties as guaranteed by the Constitution.
Well, before we go beyond that, that graphic there, Alan, reminds me of a graphic from your political history.
The Bill of Rights, yes. Yes.
We think we used the graphic that showed the Bill of Rights, and underneath it a slogan that said, "Void where prohibited by law."
Yes.
And I think that probably doesn't have any less applicability today than it did when you ran for mayor back in 76 or somewhere around there?
78, I believe it was. You're right, David. The big difference is that more and more of those bills of rights are being prohibited by law. Well, they're being more and more constricted. We have far less freedom today than we had when I ran for office, and I was worried about it then.
You must be losing sleep now.
Yes. The final resolution, reining in executive military action, recognizing that war powers reside solely in the legislative branch.
And historically, how have you seen that progressing?
Well,
I think, like you said, the Congress has not declared war since the Second World War. World War, and yet
That is,
hundreds of thousands of American soldiers have been killed.
yes. This is, if we would simply return to our Constitution, that would solve a lot of these problems. Unfortunately, no one wants to do that. The Congress wants to pass the buck to the executive. The people have not jumped up and told the Congress to do its job, so we've passed the buck to the Congress passed the buck to the executive. The executive is quite willing to bomb other countries, as we've seen throughout the last several decades. And unfortunately, the whole system of checks and balances isn't functioning anymore because the Congress isn't doing its job, and ultimately it's because the people aren't doing their job.
Well, that seems like a contradiction to me in some sense, that if the American people really don't want us to get involved with these foreign wars and intervention, then somehow or other that should be fairly evident to the people in Congress, who are the most direct representatives of those people. Why are they so willing to turn their authority over to the executive branch, when in fact, if we have any understanding of what the American people really want, that shouldn't be a viable option for them. They should be fearful of being voted out of office if they abdicate their responsibility, and they would seem to enhance their reelection prospects if they were opposing some of these wars. But that dynamic doesn't seem to be taking effect.
Well, that's exactly the way it's supposed to work, David, but it isn't working very well. And
well, do the American people really want more war then? Is that what we're saying?
I think the American people see foreign policy as a very complex subject. And when we're being told by people who have a dog in the fight, whether they're an industrialist, a munition maker, or just somebody who wants to get reelected, the easiest way to manipulate people is through fear. It's not.
And has the American mainstream media gone along with those views?
Sadly to say, the media also doesn't seem to be interested. If you watch the media now, they jump on whatever the current bandwagon is. They're happy to be talking about whatever the crisis of the moment is, because they're busy selling their entertainment.
Yeah, wasn't it amazing that President Trump's popularity rating took such an uptick when he ordered that bombing of that Syrian military base, as well as all the liberal media just gushing over him. What a great presidential action it was.
And yet it was unconstitutional. There's nothing in the Constitution that supports his action. And in fact, he told us exactly why he was doing that. And it was a violation of his oath of office. It was unconstitutional. It was an emotional thing. Unfortunately, we live in a media world and an entertainment media world today where there's constant chatter 24 hours a day, and basically we're being sold these things all the time. Most of us don't have the time to pay attention to it. We'd like to be left alone to take care of our own lives, just like everybody in the world has always wanted to be left alone to live their lives. One of the things that we're trying to do with this petition, with this resolution, is to bring this issue home and to say that foreign policy may sound like a complex issue, but when you get down to its basics, it is simply the relationship between countries, how the United States relates to the rest of the world. And if we do that in a non-interventionist manner, in a peaceful manner, the world will be safer. The other people in the world won't feel as threatened and won't need to fight against us. And this is really our mission, is to go to the American people, to try to bring these issues up and say, it's time, it's high time, it's past time for us to focus on the issue of war and peace, the issue of foreign policy. This is the single most important issue facing the country ultimately, because not only does it cost so much in lives and so much in dollars, it will eventually bankrupt us if we keep doing it the way we've been doing it. And if the American people will start paying attention, then ultimately the Congress will pay attention. You're right. Right now, the Congress is only interested in being reelected, and they're not concerned because the American people aren't concerned yet. So that's what we're trying to do. And one of the things that we've been doing is trying to get endorsements on our resolution, which we're looking for individual endorsements, and people can go and sign it electronically at foreignpolicyalliance.org. We're looking for endorsements from civic clubs, business organizations, religious groups, veterans groups, and we've had a number of prominent academics and writers who've already endorsed the resolution. There's a list of them here and on our website. You can see the list. To give you just a few of them, Garden Adams, who's a former White House budget advisor, Colonel Andrew Basevich, who's written a number of books about the new militarism. We have Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was a chief of staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell. And for our libertarians, we have Jacob Hornberger, who's with the Future of Freedom Foundation, and Jason Sorens with the Free State Movement. So we're trying to gradually get endorsements from individuals, from academics, and ultimately we're going to have to get endorsements from members of Congress. We're working on that. They're coming along very slowly because their constituents haven't told them yet that we need to reform U.S. foreign policy.
Well, there's probably a handful of congressmen or even senators who are less militaristically inclined than their colleagues, and certainly I would think that you would have some success in enlisting some of those folks.
We're working on it. It's a long-term process. Nobody wants to get out there ahead and jump in line first.
Yeah, of course. Ron Paul was, when he was in Congress, I'm sure he might have been one of the first signers, but there have been very few people that have been as anti-interventionist as Congressman Ron Paul from Lake Jackson.
That's correct. Ron Paul was kind of a lone eagle, but there are a few others now who look like they're much more non-interventionist. There's Thomas Massey from Kentucky. There's Justin Amash from Michigan, I believe. And then, of course, Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, is certainly less interventionist. There are a number who are not on the intervention bandwagon, but so far they're not willing to lead the change that we need.
New paradigm shift in foreign policy. Well, I think it's time for us to wrap up. Alan, I want to express my appreciation to you for not only coming on this show to tell us about the Foreign Policy Alliance, but also for your ongoing work with that group in a very uphill, obviously, battle to kind of change the hearts and minds of the American public about what the disasters and dangers that are of our past foreign policy, and how it's well past time to formulate a new policy that benefits all Americans from a standpoint of much less tension and threats from around the world, and to promote a peaceful coexistence of all the people on the planet. So certainly appreciate your work, and thank you for joining us tonight on this show.
Thank you for having me, and everyone sign the resolution, please.
Okay, good enough. Thank you.